Good evening, everyone. My name is Quandra Spates. I am here with my co-host today, Patrick Brutus, as well as Robert McKay. And we would like to welcome all our viewers. Thank you again for tuning in to Help One Save One. This show is being presented to you by Help One Save One. Help One Save One is a community-inspired organization. We have created topics to educate as well as enlighten and inform the community. Help One Save One email address is helponesaveone@hotmail.com. The telephone number is 312-313-6977. And then the Facebook page, of course, is Help One Save One. This is a live interactive show, so we're asking all our viewers to please call in at 312-738-1060. Once again, that's 312-738-1060. Last week, we discussed on our show Restorative Justice with Jose Wilson. It was a great show. We encourage you all to go and look at that on YouTube. As mentioned in our previous shows, we have been discussing the Kerner Commission Report. It has been our foundation to support the topics we will be discussing over the last remaining weeks. So we've been discussing the Kerner Commission Report at this point for 11 weeks. It has been our intent to create a progressive series of informative discussions regarding our journey as African American by examining where we once were, where we want to be, and where we actually are. So today we're going to be actually wrapping up with our last remaining weeks, and we just wanted to wrap up and recap over the last 5 weeks of the show. So some of the topics we discussed was education, economic empowerment, gentrification, and post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic slave disorder. And so we presented these topics designed to educate and support our positions on how the above societal issues impact the African American community, one way or another. So with that being said, I'm going to briefly go over the overhead, and we're going to show that the Kerner Commission Report, this is a brochure, just discussing the Kerner Commission Report and how important it is, and how it is and what is done for our community or lack thereof. And then we're going to go to a brief video.
What happened? Why did it happen? And what can we do to keep it from happening again and again? President Johnson, unfortunately, as some people did, thought that these riots were the result of some kind of conspiracy, that they were organized and planned. That was not true. We said that the conditions were such, the horrible conditions, almost criminally inferior school systems, jobs having moved out or disappearing altogether through automation, housing was terribly deteriorated, and the police-community relations were just at flashpoint. We said there wasn't any conspiracy here, no planning, that the conditions were such that almost any random spark could set off a riot, and that's what had occurred. We said, we used the word racism, and some said, well, should we say that? We thought it was important to say that straight out. And we said that these black ghettos had been created by white racism, and they were maintained because of white racism, and that you had to do something about that, about the segregation and against the discrimination against black people. He thought we went too far in what we recommended against racism and against wretched poverty which existed in the cities, and he rejected the report. We didn't solve these problems. I think a lot of people think, well, civil rights, we did all that, and poverty, we did that. No, they're still with us, and in some ways, poverty is worse, and that's not good for any of us, because it's really true, as my old populist friend from Texas, Jim Hightower, says, everybody does better when everybody does better.
So what you saw there was an interesting video that captured the essence of what occurred during the 60s that was a flashpoint for not really the beginning of racism, but really for the racism that we know today and the racism that we've come to know over the last 50 years. Now, during that video, we received a call, and so we want to go to our caller right now. Caller, what's your comment or question? Thank you for joining the show this afternoon.
Yes, sir. You know, when I was growing up, I'm a 70-year-old Vietnam vet. But when I was going to school, teachers were there to teach, not to be anything else but teachers. Now they got to watch out for this and watch out for that. But the thing, what I want to say is, anybody or almost anybody could be a teacher, and I'll tell you why. The test for the children and the teachers have been dummied down for the last 10 or 15 years. The education these kids are getting now, it's a shame. The money, I'm not blaming the teacher, I'm blaming the mayor and his cronies because they don't care. All they don't want to be bothered. Send them some money, they'll shut up. The kids will be dumb, but so what? What do we care? That's how it is.
So, caller, thank you for your comment. We appreciate that, as it actually leads us into our, one of the first shows that we did over this season was talk about education. And so our caller, highlighted that some of the educational tests are dumbed down, and we have been passing, a generation of students who aren't prepared for the real world, the manufacturing world, for college, for the labor force. Right. So, when we talked about education, I think we touched on that subject. And so what are our thoughts about that? Are we passing a generation of kids through schools who aren't prepared for the world we live in today?
Well, actually, the education system is dumbed down across America, across this country. Mm-hmm. And the government is spearheading this whole process because at one point, even in your elementary programs, people were educated to move up to the next level and then the next level and on up to postgraduate studies. You don't find that any longer because the motive now is to reduce the population in this country. And once this Kerner Commission Report, and we'll continue to refer to them, mm-hmm. because the Kerner Commission Report, as Senator Fred Harris, the last surviving member of that Kerner Commission, stated a few moments ago, is that they were under the impression the government has a tendency to villainize a group that they want to eliminate or attack. And we find that in different countries. They've done it to the Japanese, the Chinese. They've done it to us as a people because we find ourselves being the police fearing for their lives anytime they approach a black person, and they're doing that in order to begin the process of elimination. Has always been there.
So, Robert,
I was just going to just add that here in especially the Chicago public schools, we have a myriad of issues. So, I mean, not only that we have low performing schools, we also have schools that's plagued with budgetary issues, school closing, sex abuse scandals. High penalty for African American children than any other race. I mean, and when you have all that compounded upon and wanting children going there, then you got the schools are overpopulated, meaning that there are so many students to one teacher. How do you expect for the students to actually learn and the teachers to be actually able to teach?
Well, that's the purpose, as the gentleman just spoke about, dumbing down students here in Chicago, but it's across the country. It's the process of elimination. Now, how all of a sudden are schools underperforming when we have the same system of certified teachers coming out of educational training programs for teachers? Now they have these charter schools where they're bringing in people who have expertise in a particular business or skill, mm-hmm. and without being a trained, certified mm-hmm. teacher.
Well, what's funny is getting back to the point of the caller and some of the things that we raised here about the standards being dramatically lowered in order to pass folks through the system. I actually read this morning that the University of Chicago will begin in the year 2023 to go away, wipe out the ACT and the SAT requirement for college entrance. And so is there a way that maybe they are... At the same time, we acknowledge that these are standards that have been, like I had to take the ACT to get to college.
Right.
And I'm sure you all did also.
Of course.
But now, can we take advantage? Are these opportunities to really advance the enrollment of inner city and urban children by seeing a trend where colleges and universities will reduce their standards in order to maybe accelerate the acceptance or entrance of a certain demographic that doesn't always get into, these types of schools. And so, is that something we can possibly take advantage of?
I mean, when you say reduce their standards, I mean,
Well, taking away the ACT test completely takes out a certain benchmark that you would have had to normally attain in order to gain admittance into
well,
a
I
certain
understand
school.
that, absolutely.
Right.
But I mean, that doesn't not
Does that equal the
that
field?
doesn't correct the education that they're getting in. I mean, I don't know, because I think you may be putting children against children who has come in with a better quality education, especially if they're coming, I'm not going to say especially if they're coming from Chicago public schools, but we're saying that the school systems right now are not educating our children.
Right, but to Robert's
So-
point, is that also probably another manufactured scenario that is being created in order to set us up for failure?
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. And as the gentleman stated, and I can continue to go back to him, he's a Vietnam war veteran. He comes out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he's seen this. This is history, which you young people, you millennials and the Generation X's have not seen. And that's what the disconnect is.
I don't know what generation I'm in.
It depends on your age. That's how they define
I
it.
won't tell my age on air today.
Right.
I mean, but with all these issues, I mean, we even talk about school closings. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. As a parent, you have children in the CPS school systems, right?
Yes.
I mean, does these issues concern you? In your opinion, how would a elected school board maybe correct some of these issues?
So I'm certainly all in favor for an elected school board, and I do believe certain parents in different, classes and where we are in our personal lives, I think sometimes we tend to put ourselves in a bubble and immune ourselves to the other conditions that other children face. And what we all have to understand is that we're all in this together. If we're trying to improve the educational environment for children, in particular this district here at the lower, then that's going to affect all the kids. And so we should all be advocating for that. But, my kids are fine for now, and I hope that the CPS system, as long as we're in it, continues to try to get better. I don't necessarily see that across the board. I mean, we see multiple school closings. We see dilapidated school conditions in certain neighborhoods, and those always tend to trend in black and mostly black neighborhoods. And so we already see that there's a great disparity amongst the quality. Like I think a year and a half ago, Walter Payton School got a $17 million TIF deal to expand their facilities, and we just saw South Loop get $50 million to expand their school. And we're seeing school expansions at public dollars being utilized and being, done to improve those educational environments. And we're not seeing that same type of investment across the board in our neighborhoods. And so where in Englewood, for example, Robert, they've closed 4 schools and they're giving us 1.
Right.
I don't necessarily think that's a fair trade-off.
Absolutely not.
Well, you have to look
Of course
at the
not.
results of the gentrification that occurred in Inglewood. And when you eliminate the population, you're not going to have the people. And we knew this was coming in the early 70s. And that's what's called disasters. And we were not prepared for this disaster we're living in today. Disaster preparedness was not implemented over in Inglewood. And of course, we understand that Metro Railroad wanted that property, wanted the land over in Inglewood, so that's why they eliminated the people. So when
Right.
you eliminate the people and the students, you don't need the schools.
Right, that's the flyover project going on.
That's the
right now.
flyover.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so we talked about gentrification with Ro Davis, I believe, in week 4. And we had an interesting conversation with him, and we talked about a multiple level of things that affects our neighborhoods, such as housing disparity costs and residential construction, business construction. We talked about a number of things, Quandra.
Yeah, we did. I mean, that just leads me to ask the question between you two gentlemen: who does gentrification really affect? Is it who do you think it really affects in the community?
It affects the target. And we know where the targets are. The bullseye has been placed on the black community when it comes to gentrification. And then they're moving around other communities, other ethnicities, and they're moving them over into the black communities, which has been eliminated.
So I think it's very important, though, and I will slightly present an alternative reality to gentrification. I've
Please.
had this conversation with a number of people, as of recently yesterday.
Yes.
And I always want to ask, is gentrification good or bad? And I think in certain cases, perception does match the reality, but we also must acknowledge that gentrification does not always only mean white people coming to your neighborhood. Gentrification can also mean black gentrification. I mean, we also need some of that in our neighborhoods. And I look at a community such as Woodlawn, Englewood, or even North Lawndale, where there are, plenty of housing opportunities, yet the neighborhoods are affected by crime and bad education. So we're not seeing the investments from black couples, families, millennials or what have you, those who are income ready to move in those neighborhoods and save those communities, versus white folks coming in. So gentrification can also sometimes mean black gentrification as well,
But
which is
just
also
because
welcomed.
it's African American gentrification doesn't mean that it makes it better. Because at the end of the day, you're still displacing people who have vested in that community.
But the perception that makes gentrification a bad word in our community is that it's primarily white folks coming in and replacing us and taking us out and taking our properties and reinvesting in our communities and taking over, such as what happened in North Lawndale in the pre-60s, where
Yeah.
it used to be a black neighborhood. The Jewish community came in and took over, and then after the riots, they've been gone and have remained away.
Well, Patrick, you have to understand that this is spearheaded by the government, the city government, the state government, or the county government. And the gentrification is created when you have a vacuum that's been created in the black community. You move the people out, and then when those lands, those vacant lots or vacant blocks have occurred, the developers are going to come in, and they're going to bring in other people when they build unaffordable housing.
And
Absolutely.
we have a caller. Caller, what's your question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that gentrification it's a double-edged sword, just like you're saying. And there's no value in it being of one ethnic group or another. In fact, gentrification that brings diverse ethnic groups into monolithic communities is probably a good thing for all those communities. And that's my comment. I'll get off and let you respond. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. Now, so that's a good question that the caller raised, or a good point that he raised in terms of making a community more diverse and multicultural.
Right.
His point was that it's good for neighborhoods to experience that. Question, is it really?
It's good when you have lands that have been vacated. You don't have gentrification in stabilized communities. When you have a community that has been destabilized, such as in the black community, you're going to create the opportunities for developers to come in and fulfill or create housing or businesses that will fill in the void that has been left by the removal of the people who were there before.
Right. And so I think in some cases, the danger in opening up the door for multiculturalism
Okay.
is that at some point you're going to lose your culture.
Okay. Well, you
And
understand
I
that.
guess those are different perspectives.
Well,
And that's a danger.
Yeah.
That's the danger, because the black community is losing its foothold in certain neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
For one, we don't own the land. And I think that that's also an issue. When you don't have control, I mean, you have like the Asian community. They are almost seem like they're formidable when it comes to gentrification because they own their land. It doesn't seem like gentrification really affects those communities as much as other communities as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, when you look at that also, and when you say Asian, they are identified with a area, a region, and they come with Chinese, whether they're Japanese or however many Asians that come in those groups, and they're identified with countries. The black people who are in the cities here are not associated with any particular country. We're only identifying with a continent.
Well, I would say that the interesting aspect to multiculturalism as it pertains to gentrification, especially in Chicago, is you look at Chinatown, there is no gentrification in Chinatown.
No.
You look at a
Hardly.
neighborhood like Beverly or Mount Greenwood, there is no gentrification in a lot of pockets in those communities. You look at anywhere where Latinos and large populations move into a community, it will become a Latino neighborhood. So I think the fear of the black community, especially in a city like Chicago, is extremely warranted because the neighborhoods that people come in and take over happen to be ours.
Right. Well, I mean, we can continue this, or we can talk a little bit more about economic empowerment.
Well, one more point before you move on to that, and we'll go right to it.
Okay.
But the gentrification, I look at the Kerner Commission Report and how it stated that in 10 years, the urban communities will become majority Negro. Those are the terms they used back then. And then in order to avoid that, they opened up the suburbs. There have been publications on these particular issues. The Kerner Commission Report, if you look at Chapter 17, it talks about housing. It talked about how to avoid the conditions that this country was identified and moving towards. So then they moved to redress that by breaking up the communities and allowing the black community to be dispersed into other areas, into the suburbs. And we're all distracted now, and we're replaced, replenished, and with other groups.
Right. So when we had, and you're absolutely right. So in that situation, we've lost our economic base in places like Cleveland, a lot of different neighborhoods in Chicago during the time, because Memphis, like our family, when we were in Chicago, we were, one of those families that left the city and went to the suburbs, right? And so when we had Amara Enya on the show to talk about economic empowerment, she discussed at great length her plan to initiate cooperative economics. And so talking about that in a way that will help black people understand that we need to really pool our resources together, is that still a valid concept today in Chicago?
Well, I know every year at Kwanzaa time we talk about cooperative economics, and we haven't seen anyone put that into play, into practice yet. So
it's long overdue, and if we're going to buy back our neighborhoods and maintain our streets and take back our communities, we've got to work together in our schools and every foundation that we are in. We've got to be working together, and cooperative economics. That could be a way.
I mean, but cooperative economics have always worked. I mean, even during sharecropping, that was a way that a lot of the sharecroppers were able to maintain their crops and be able to make a living for their families. It's because they created these cooperative economic communities, and they were very successful.
Well, some were successful and very few.
Well, that was because of not because of the system. It was because of those other controlling factors, like the white communities didn't want to sell them supplies. You didn't shop with them, so they weren't going to give you any of their. They pushed back. Basically.
So a critical element to having a successful cooperative economic model is controlling the supply chain.
Absolutely right.
We've got to be able to have distribution, we've got to have warehousing, we've got to have the products, we've got to have the consumers, we've got to have the outlets. So we've got to be able to control the entire food chain, as it were, supply chain, in order for us not to be subject to, being cut off.
And we don't have a player in the game when it comes to that from our community.
Well, we got to get there, Robert.
Okay, well then we put the plan down, Patrick, and we will work it.
Philip, Patrick, it's okay. We've had 10 weeks to get my name right. As long as you call the show, 312-738-1060. Doesn't matter what our names are. You just call in and ask us any comment or question, and we'll try to address it live on the show.
Right.
Because you make the show. It's important for us to be here.
Absolutely.
We have 2 more weeks of this exciting, I think, inaugural broadcast where we've been talking about such a wonderful
Wonderful topics.
The Kerner Commission Report, the 50 years since that report came out, we've been addressing multiple issues regarding how the black family has been affected. And we're wrapping up, so Quandra, take us home.
Sure. Well, I want to thank both Patrick as well as Robert. Great conversation, guys. I really appreciate that. It's very important that our viewers understand where we're coming from, why these topics are very important for our community. Hopefully, we've enlightened you all and made you think a little bit. Next week, we will be also continue to wrap up the Kerner Commission Report and some of the topics we brought forth to educate you all. And we really look forward to you joining us again next week. Have a great evening. Thank you. Anything from you guys? Anything?
Well, one thing is, this is 50 years after the Kerner Commission report was released in 1968. Had Dr. King lived, he was assassinated 1 month and 3 days after this report was released. Had he lived, he would have addressed it. Our leadership in our communities, our churches, our organizations have not dealt with this. They need to go back and study it, understand it, so we can begin to implement and up to cooperative economics.
I love that. All right.
I believe Jesse Jackson is still around. Go, Jesse!
Thank you.